Welcome to this evening's Adam Smith Institute webinar. Thanks for registering and spending an hour of your Tuesday evening with us, as always. My name is Daniel Pryor, and I'm the head of programs at the Adam Smith Institute. For those of you who might not be familiar with our work or are coming to one of our webinars for the first time, the ASI is a free market think tank based in London in the UK. And our goal is to try to change public policy as well as public opinion through our research, media, as well as events, mainly online virtual events for the moment, and education. Now, this evening's webinar is going to delve into how education has been affected by coronavirus and what the best responses from a policy perspective might be. Now, as many of you are aware, schools across the UK have been shut for several months now in the wake of the Covid-19 pandemic. That's just changed, as I'm sure we'll hear about very shortly. And the fallout from this school's closure has been pretty immense. We've seen some rather intense protests at the government's initial decision to use an algorithm in determining A-level results because we didn't have the typical examinations. And whilst we had some pupils able to access online alternatives to some of their normal lessons, others, perhaps from more disadvantaged backgrounds in the UK, were left with far less or little access to education during the shutdown. But in the USA, as we're going to hear about, parents and teachers have started pandemic pods, as they're sometimes referred to, as well as other innovative alternatives to the traditional classroom environment. Now children are returning to school and they're going to have to wear masks in communal areas if they're in an area facing a local lockdown in the UK. And even the schools in other areas, whilst they get to retain discretion about mask requirements, there's certainly a lively debate going on about whether that's the correct move and where the balance on that issue should be struck. So for this webinar, we're delighted to be joined by three prominent education experts to discuss how COVID-19 has affected schooling. And once we've heard from them, we're going to be going to questions from all of you watching along, as well as those that have been sent in beforehand. But for now, let's kick things off with our first speaker of the evening, which is Dr. Joanna Williams. And she is the founder and director of KEO, which is a new think tank that stands for Democracy, Liberty, Prosperity, Humanity and Tolerance, which all sound very, very good to me. And she's also recently completed a report for Civitas titled COVID Kids, the Response of Schools to Coronavirus. Many different hats that Joanna wears. She's also the associate editor of the online magazine Spiked and a regular news reviewer for Sky News. And she's going to discuss her views on the schools lockdown and its impact on education. So over to you, Joanna.
Thank you. So I first wrote that schools should stay open before they even closed down for a couple of weeks prior to Boris Johnson's announcement that schools would close. It became increasingly aware and there was more of a clamour of voices calling for schools to shut down. And I argued at that point that to shut schools down would be a mistake. I followed it up about 2 or 3 weeks later in an article in the Telegraph arguing the same and really making the case that teachers needed to get back into the classroom, which briefly saw me, I think, the most unpopular woman in Britain. I'm saying this not to show off, certainly not to claim any psychic powers. I don't even claim to be terribly good at interpreting data or reading scientific papers. I think what really struck me when it was even talked about closing schools down was just what an utterly unprecedented move this would be. When you think of the historical crises that Britain as a country has faced over the past century, not just in terms of illnesses and pandemics, but in terms of major international events, and yet schools have throughout remained open. And the importance of education, and more importantly, I think the significance of school as a social institution really drove home to me the significance and the message that shutting schools down to all children would really send out. And I thought this was such a terrible thing. It couldn't possibly happen. And as soon as schools did close, it seemed to me absolutely imperative to get them back open again as soon as possible. You'll have to believe me when I say on this occasion, it gives me absolutely no satisfaction whatsoever to have been proved right on this issue. I think the consequences of closing schools have been absolutely disastrous, and we now know that no child without underlying serious underlying medical conditions has died from coronavirus. That children stand far more chance of being killed by a lightning strike, certainly by being run over on their way to school, than they do from catching coronavirus in the classroom. And yet the consequences of closing school have been, well, and what was immediately apparent was the huge educational inequality, vast disparities between private sector and the lessons, online lessons that many private schools were able to maintain, and what some children in most likely state schools were being offered, which seemed to be the odd emailed home worksheet to print out and complete if they were lucky. So inequality became a massive issue, I think, and a really growing issue. We've seen research out today suggesting that some children are likely a minimum of 3 months behind. Teachers are claiming that some children will be 6 months behind in their education, which is actually more time than they've had away from the classroom, on the assumption that they will have actually fallen behind in this time. Obviously, we've seen the consequences of abandoning exams, and I think for me that again was a real trigger point, because whether we like it or not, and I actually think it's probably a bad thing, but exams hold together, it seems, so much of our education system. They provide targets to be met, and they provide a focus now for education. So as soon as exams were done away with, the very purpose of teaching seemed to disappear overnight. And it was particularly pupils in year 11 and year 13 who were left with no input, or very, very little input in the majority of schools. We see future consequences already in the pipeline, most immediately in terms of next year's exams and discussion about whether the content of the curriculum should be cut, or whether exams should be delayed, or possibly both, or exams should be scrapped altogether. It's clearly concerning a number of people, it seems, that the true extent of what's happened over the past 5 months will be exposed in a day of reckoning if exams do take place next year, as they should do. But also knock-on effects, long-term knock-on effects in terms of future earnings potential for pupils, and future opportunities for social mobility. So I think quite a lot of that the disadvantages for pupils, I mean, we've also not looked at the potential impact upon pupils' mental health of being outside of school, impact upon their physical health of not having the opportunity to get out and have PE lessons and extracurricular activities, impact upon their socialization. All of these impacts now, I think, are at least beginning to be fairly well documented, and no doubt will receive far more attention in the weeks and months to come if schools can remain open. What I want to do in the remaining couple of minutes is just touch upon some reasons why I think this has happened. Why did we close schools, and what might some of the long-term repercussions be? One thing that really struck me in all of this is just our complete inability as a society to articulate the case for education, to make the case for schools even as institutions. And whenever people tried to argue for schooling in any description, or for schooling closing, people fell back upon arguments around the vulnerability of children, around the mental health of children, and even around social mobility and skills. And these all avoided really making the case for education as a good thing in and of itself, and particularly Hannah Arendt's idea of education as an intergenerational transaction, where we as adults in society have a responsibility, I think a collective responsibility for children, a collective responsibility to inculcate them into the knowledge that we have of the world. And we clearly, as a society, have lost all faith in this as an intellectual project. We don't see a collective responsibility for doing anything other than keeping children physically safe, which seems to me the absolute minimal responsibility that adults should have. Nobody was really able to make a case for education being important in its own terms, and particularly not linked to knowledge. There was no positive vision of schools on offer. School was presented as a safety net that provided food for the most vulnerable children in society, or spotted children who were worryingly potentially victims of child abuse. But again, we're talking real bare minimum stuff here in terms of adult responsibility. And I think if we'd had a bit more as a society, a collective sense of the importance of education and the significance of education and the impact it has on children's life and its necessity to continuing our society, then I think we'd have been far less enthusiastic to close schools down. So just to end then, some of my concerns for the future, I think the inequality that's been exposed over the past few months, I can only see that continuing. And one of the reasons why I think it will continue is my concern that some children will be returning to school in September to a full academic curriculum with a wide range of subjects and being taught by subject specialists, whereas other children are going to return to either a very reduced curriculum to focus on English and maths. We can argue whether that might be necessary or not, at least for a short period of time. But more importantly, it seems that some children will be returning to a heavily trauma-informed approach to education, with far more emphasis on personal social health education, essentially turning the classroom into a site of therapy for children who are perceived to be incredibly emotionally vulnerable. It's no doubt that many children have suffered mentally and emotionally over the past few weeks, but it seems to me that the best way to build resilience is to get things back to normal as soon as possible. And back to normal should mean a reasonable amount of academic pressure and a full academic curriculum. I think the therapeutic approach to education is only going to increase. That's my worry as we go forward. My two other concerns I want to finish with. One is the continual presentation we seem to have at the moment coming at us from all angles of the school as a site of infection, that children need to wear masks. There's no evidence whatsoever that children need to wear masks, especially as they're expected to maintain social distancing from the teacher and to be conducting their education in bubbles. So quite what mask wearing adds to this, I really don't know. And there's quite a lot of scientific evidence about the dangers or certainly some of the risks of mask wearing to children, particularly children who are likely to drop them on the floor when they go to the toilet, shove them in dirty pockets, swap them, and no doubt roll them around in their school dinner as well before putting them back on for display. So the idea that this presentation of school as a site of infection rather than a good positive institution in society concerns me. But my final concern is the idea that adults, again as a collective, are becoming increasingly alienated from children. The idea, if you're working in a primary school, if you're working with the youngest children and a child falls over and hurts themselves, that you can't then pick that child up and give them a hug, that you have to, as the teacher, maintain a distance from children at all times, that children are portrayed almost as a potential problem in the sense that they could be a risk to and infect teachers, I think creates a real barrier between the generations in exactly the place where we need to have a relationship between adults and children in the most productive and the most effective sense. So yeah, to turn this around, my hope for the future is that more and more people can really make the case for education as being something that's so important to our society and so important in as an intergenerational relationship and intergenerational responsibility that we never ever consider closing schools again.
Thank you very much for that, Joanna. Just a couple of follow-up questions from me before we move on to our next speaker, and maybe to push back a little on the anti-shutdown stance. I think most people's worries with keeping schools open wasn't necessarily the health of the kids themselves. It was more of pupils going home with COVID-19 and, say, seeing their grandparents at the weekend, or, as I think you alluded to, spreading it to teachers. Do you find this a kind of more compelling reason for the shutdown, or do you not think that that's justified?
No, I don't think that's justified. I mean, I totally take on board the argument, and it's certainly an argument I've heard lots of times before. I think we had a duty as a society to protect the most vulnerable individuals. And I think that meant closing down care homes to visitors. It meant definitely not discharging sick people from hospitals into care homes without having been thoroughly returning a negative COVID test, first of all. And it perhaps would have meant advising children, hey, if you can go a few weeks without visiting grandma right now, that would probably be a sensible precaution to take. But I think there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever to suggest that closing schools is a proportional response, even at risk of transmitting virus throughout the country. There's no evidence where schools have opened that widespread rates of infection, that rates of infection have increased more widely into the community. And this was particularly ironic, not now, but certainly if you go back 6 weeks, when pubs, restaurants, cafes, leisure centres were all open. My daughter could go and queue outside Primark and go shopping, yet she couldn't go to school.
And just a final one before we go on to Calvin, do you think, just to kind of, I guess, get a better idea of your stance towards the shutdown, do you think it could have worked in theory if we had a more viable infrastructure of remote learning in place? Because I noticed a lot of the negatives from the lockdown were contingent on poor decisions about the A-levels algorithm and a lack of planning for e-learning and things like this? Or do you just think that it was never necessary regardless of whether?
Well, I think it was never necessary. I think I would put a slight proviso on that. I think there should have been more freedom, essentially, for individual schools to make decisions in their own individual, unique set of circumstances. So what I'm hugely opposed to, and have been opposed to from the beginning, was the government's blanket directive that schools across the country would shut to all but the children of key workers. I think the arguments for closing, say, a large inner city sixth form at the peak of a pandemic for a couple of weeks would be very, very sensible and not something I would have any issue with whatsoever. However, your small rural primary in a place that didn't have any coronavirus infections for miles around would seem far less rational. So my position was really to the blanket ban rather than to individual schools doing what's sensible.
Well, thank you.
But sorry, just very final quick point on the e-learning. I mean, e-learning, you know, it's a great stopgap emergency measure if you need to go 1 week, 2 weeks. But it's a very, very poor substitute for in-class interaction and that relationship that children develop with the teacher. And, you know, perhaps again can work in small doses for 16, 17, 18-year-olds who've got a substantial fund of background knowledge to be able to draw upon. That's very different for 8, 9 and 10-year-olds who are by no means ready to become independent learners.
Well, thanks a lot for answering my follow-up questions there. And we've already got several questions in the Q&A box. So moving on to our next speaker, who is Calvin Robinson, a teacher, former assistant principal, director and governor of a London secondary state school, as well as a consultant for the Department for Education. And he's going to be discussing the government's plans on mask-wearing schools, as well as his thoughts more generally on the current education policy. So Calvin, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And as usual, I agreed with every word Joanna said there. Very sound. I want to talk briefly about, well, I say briefly, about the importance of reopening schools, and then I will get to the mask issue as well. Because I think for me as a teacher, you know, one of the primary concerns is the amount of learning that our young people have missed out on. You know, a third of a year is unprecedented. And the consequences of that, and what we're seeing as a result of that, is this disadvantage gap is widening. And I think that's down to remote teaching and learning just not working. It's not a viable option. I think we've got a lot of reasons why it doesn't work, but one of the particular reasons why we're seeing the disadvantage gap widen is because a lot of homes might have a computer, might have a couple of computers, but then they might have a few siblings all wanting to use the computer at the same time. They might have a parent working from home. They might not have an internet connection. They might not have any access to school's resources online. The school might not be doing anything online. There's so many of these reasons here that are kind of preventing people from accessing their teaching and learning. And I've noticed that this is backed up by the research. So the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Institute of Education did a joint survey of 4,000 parents, school-aged parents, or parents of school-age children rather. And they noted that higher income parents reported better access to online classes than lower income parents. So that kind of backs it up straight away. But if you look at the stats around that, 64% of secondary pupils in state schools from wealthier households received some kind of online teaching or online support or some kind of teaching experience. 46% of pupils from lower income families received that kind of experience. And then if we look at the independent sector, so private schools, 82% of pupils received some kind of online teaching or online support. So the disparity there is very clear from the offset, that 82% in the independent sector versus 46% of pupils from lower income families in the state sector receiving some kind of communication, some kind of teaching and learning experience online. And then if we look at primary schools, I think it's 58% of primary pupils from the least well-off families didn't have any access to a safe place to study, a quiet area to study. So forget the resources, forget the computers, the internet access. A majority of primary school kids didn't have a place to sit down with a book and do some work. So taking kids out of the school environment is completely detrimental to their educational experience. And I think children from better off families spent 30% more time on their home learning than those from poorer families. And children from poorer families did I think it was less than an hour of learning per day compared to wealthier families. So we're seeing this gap widening and widening, and this is backed up by the teachers as well. So I mean, I can speak anecdotally as a teacher, but the Education Endowment Foundation did a report too. They surveyed a whole bunch of teachers who said that in private schools, they experienced 3/4 of the work that they sent out to kids returned back to them. So if I'm, as a class teacher, I'm sending work out, whether that's worksheets or online examinations, whatever I'm sending to my pupils, if I'm only getting 3/4 of them back, that's a manageable issue, but it's still a big issue for me as a teacher. That means that there are a few gaps that need plugging there, but that's in the private sector. In state schools, in the most advantaged state schools, only 1/3 of pupils returned their work. And then if we look at the disadvantaged state schools, only 8% of pupils returned any work. So kids simply weren't doing any work over the entire period of lockdown. So just the amount of learning that's been missed out on there is incomprehensible to me. 2 million pupils in the UK, so around 1 in 5 had no schoolwork or did less than an hour of schoolwork every day over lockdown. So we can't afford to not go back. That kind of, we can't miss out on that much learning. It's just unfeasible. The National Foundation for Educational Research surveyed 4,000 pupils, parents and pupils, and got a similar result. So 1/3 of pupils were not engaged with their lessons, and fewer than half had bothered to return their work. And pupils in the most disadvantaged schools were the least likely to be engaged with remote learning. And I won't keep throwing stats at you, just a few more things I want to point out, that 60% of primary pupils and 52% of secondary pupils in the survey did not have any live lessons online. So it's one thing to say we'll take schools remotely and we'll go to a remote learning experience and have, Google Classrooms or Microsoft Teams, and we'll have a similar experience to what we'd have in the classroom. But it's another thing entirely to say we're just going to email some worksheets out and hope that people get on with it, and I hope that kids do something. Part of my role with the DFE was reaching out to secondary schools in London to provide assistance with setting up remote learning. And some schools have done some fantastic stuff. They really have. They've got almost like a real life lesson experience going on, where they're teaching entire year groups at the same time and passing on that knowledge. But others have really, really struggled to do anything at all. So it's really worrying from my perspective. Pupils whose parents had higher levels of education tend to spend most time doing their schoolwork. And I think we see this often in school, that parents who gain something from education themselves kind of pass on that value of the importance of education. But parents who don't necessarily see that they took much from school don't pass on those values. And while kids are in school, we're reinforcing the importance of education, the importance of knowledge every day. And we're always struggling to keep it at a high level of importance, because kids will go home and learn different things at home and have different influences, and then they come back to us. But while they're not with us at all, so many kids have been let down on that front. So the result of all this is the growing disadvantage gap. But as a result of that gap, we're seeing a growth in the attainment gap. And when I talk about attainment, I'm talking about, the levels that kids are at, the grades that they're receiving. And one report showed that the gap between the highest attainers and the lowest attainers, so the kids with the highest grades and the lowest grades, has increased as a result of the coronavirus lockdown. So if we just look at the odd year groups, so year group 3, year 5, year 7, and year 9. So in year 7 and in year 9 in secondary school, the attainment gap has increased by 13%, which I think is quite dramatic. But then if you look at primary, in year 5, the attainment gap has increased by 39%. And the largest increase was in year 3, which is an increase of 52%. So this is not the gap itself, this is the increase of the gap by 52%. So it's affecting younger children more. You know, as a teacher, we see that if a kid has one day off school, that has an observable impact. And it takes great effort by the teacher and the pupil and the parents to catch that kid up from one missed day. And now we've had like 3 months of kids not being in school with limited parental support where they could, granted, but limited teacher support. And that is the problem in my eyes. You know, teachers are the experts in the room. There's a reason that Google hasn't replaced school yet. And that's because teachers have the pedagogy as well as the knowledge. You know, we have the subject knowledge and we have the knowledge of how to pass that knowledge on. And that is the key of education. And you can't replace that with Google searches or Wikipedia or worksheets at home without someone there to guide you and lead you on and support you. So we've had the digital divide. You know, the government have tried to plug that gap. They've made laptops and 4G dongles available, which was a great start. But I don't think it was enough. I don't think it filtered down. I didn't see it on my end getting filtered down to all the kids that I knew that needed them. So there was still far too many young people without access to online learning. The government did fund Oak National Academy, which was a fantastic initiative. That was online lessons led by teachers. So you do have some teacher feedback there. But of course, this is all online. So if you don't have access to the internet or you don't have a computer, again, you're limited in the amount of support that you can get. There is money available. The government have made £1 billion available, 350 million of which will be spent on tutoring for the state sector. So that will hopefully help plug that gap somewhat. And the rest of the money, 650 million, will be spent on catch-up programs. Hopefully schools will have autonomy on how they spend that so that they can see where kids need help the most. And it is a good start, but I'm not convinced entirely that throwing money at the situation will solve the problem, although that just seems to be the current party policy since we found that magic money tree that we were talking about before the election. But this is all the academic difficulties. You know, this is one element of it, but of course there's also the pastoral care. And Joanna alluded to it a bit in her talk. You know, these disadvantaged pupils, there's so many vulnerable kids that are on the system, and in schools, we are keeping an eye out for them at all time because there is a fine line between being on the system and not. But while they're not with us, we don't have our eyes on them. We don't have that support structure in place. And some schools haven't been checking in regularly for whatever reasons, logistical reasons, practical reasons, but only 4 in 10 pupils were in contact with their school during lockdown. So that's another worrying aspect. And I could talk at length about exams, but I have done in the past, so I won't go into the exams, but I will, you know, back up the PM in his point that we absolutely have a moral duty to reopen schools and keep them open and not ever close them again, as if we can avoid it. It is vitally important. You know, lockdown, it was detrimental to their education. And if we're talking about the measures that are being put in place, this Daniel spoke about this tiered system in that if there's a local lockdown, everyone, teachers, pupils will be asked to wear masks in communal areas as tier 1. In tier 2, schools, or secondary schools, will go on a rota system. So they'll have 2 weeks at home to quarantine, a week in school, and then a week off. And again, I'm not convinced that will work. That's still too much time out of the classroom. And it's having kids in the classroom that's the important part. As we discussed, remote learning doesn't work. And then tier 3 would be the only key workers children and vulnerable children are in school, which is what we had before. And the reasons I don't think any of these things will work is because masks just can't work in a school environment. You know, pupils will play with them. They'll adjust them. They'll want to make them look good, thus avoiding their effectiveness by touching them and touching their face. They'll swap them with each other because they're kids and that's what they do. They'll wear them wrong. You know, they'll watch adults wearing them on the tube, on their necks, as a lot of adults do, modeling best practice. The kids will fail to wash them. You know, how many times have children failed to wash their PE kit, which needs to be washed once per week? How can you assume that a kid will wash their mask every day? It doesn't make practical sense to me. So all of these things will increase the health risks of the wearing masks, not to mention the behavioral issues. kids will be pulling at each other's elastics. You know, kids are kids, they can be mean. They'll be flicking masks across the room. As a teacher, it concerns me that I won't be able to see who's talking, who's back-chatting, who's swearing, who's chewing gum in a classroom with these masks across their faces. You know, it takes us years to develop those eyes in the back of our heads, but they are metaphorical. We can't literally see what's going on while we're writing on the board. And any low-level disruption is detrimental to the whole class's learning experience. It doesn't matter how good your teaching is or how good your curriculum is if pupils can't access it. And if there's lots of low-level disruption, they can't access the teaching and learning. So there are some positives, ways around it. You know, we can have social distancing measures. We can have one-way systems and different stairways for different year groups. We can have cleaners come in between lessons. I think a lot of hand washing would be beneficial. We can have extra sanitizers all around the school, use them between lessons, on arrival, before lunch. So there's lots of things we can do. And everything that schools do, we put risk assessments in place. So we will look at these things, but I don't think it would be good for the government to give a blanket policy on mask wearing in schools at any point. And I don't think we need to bow to the pressure of the unions. And I don't think we need to model what Scotland's doing, because they're not doing particularly well up there either. So my point to summarize is that schools need to open fully so that we can catch up on all the missed learning. We need to plug that disadvantage gap, and as a result, plug that attainment gap. We need to work on the digital divide, and we need to get kids back in school, but not with their masks, because the science doesn't back up their use. And if anything, I think it's being used as a tactic to encourage parents who are a bit anxious about sending their kids back to school. But I think, like Joanna said, we need to talk about the importance of education and why the kids need to be put back in school. We don't need to be convincing them through gimmicks. And I think that's what masks are. They're a bit of a gimmick. So let's talk about the importance of education instead. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Calvin. And I'll just ask one quick follow-up question, because I think we're a little bit behind on time. And it's from Connor Boyle in the chat, who asks, without insisting on an extra school year, can the value of lost education be regained in the time that the current pupils have left, and how could that be achieved?
It can. There are a number of ways we could do it. I wish we would have acted earlier. Like with the exams, if we hadn't cancelled them, if we'd have postponed them, we could have acted earlier for the year 11s and the year 13s. But likewise, with this school year, if we'd have got them in over the summer, that would have helped. Obviously, it's too late for that now, so we need to look at what we're going to do over Christmas, over Easter. We need to set up lots of catch-up clubs, because there is 3 months worth of learning to catch up on, but they also need to consolidate the learning that they did before that. And I think that's why we're seeing like 3 to 6 months of learning being lost, rather than just the 3 months that we've had missing. So there are things we can do as schools, but we need the autonomy and the funding to be able to do them and just get on with them. And we don't need prescriptive guidance.
I think the idea of a Christmas catch-up club sends shivers down my spine, and I finished school a long time ago. But thank you very much for your contribution there, Calvin. We'll now move on to our final speaker before Q&A, and that is Carrie Mcdonald, who is a Senior Education Fellow at FEE and also the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. And she's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute and a regular Forbes contributor. And she's going to be discussing some of the innovative alternatives to the kind of traditional classroom education that have started to spring up in the USA in the wake of the pandemic. So Carrie, over to you.
Oh, thank you, Daniel. And thank you to the Adam Smith Institute for hosting this fascinating panel. I'm delighted to be here. Yeah, we're in a real transformative moment, certainly in American education, and I think globally as well. I can share with you some of the trends and experiences over the past few months here in the US, as well as some of my predictions on the future of learning during and after the pandemic. So last March, most of the schools in the US shut down due to concerns about COVID-19. We had over 50 million school children suddenly learning at home with varying degrees of connectivity to their school district or their independent school. And I agree with Joanna and Calvin that schools should not have been shut down, certainly on the scale in which they were. Certainly at its peak, we had 1.3 billion students around the world learning at home suddenly displaced from classroom learning. And so, there were all of these headlines that began to spring up, and I'm sure I contributed to these as well, about, this was sort of the world's homeschooling moment. For those of us who are familiar with authentic homeschooling, the kind of crisis homeschooling or pandemic homeschooling that so many families found themselves in through the disruption of the school shutdowns was nothing like authentic homeschooling, where of course we're much more connected to the people, places, and things of our communities. And of course, during the shutdowns and lockdowns, we were all very much disconnected from those community interactions. And so it was certainly disruptive for everyone. And I think that's why I was particularly surprised and encouraged when one of the first US surveys came out about a month into the lockdowns from EdChoice in April, showing that more than half of the parents surveyed reported a more favorable impression of homeschooling than they had prior to the pandemic. And so I thought, gee, if you think this kind of learning at home with your children is at least, somewhat favorable, somewhat tolerable, then just imagine the real thing again when we are truly connected to those community resources. So that was interesting. The following month, Real Clear Opinion Research also had a survey confirming that many families were more satisfied with home learning than they anticipated. In fact, they found 40% of parents saying they would likely choose homeschooling or virtual learning even after the lockdowns ended. Around the same time, USA Today Ipsos poll came out finding that 60% of parents surveyed said they would likely choose school at home learning this fall rather than send their children back to school, even if schools reopen. And over the summer, parental behavior really started to reinforce a lot of these polling predictions. Parents began pulling their children out of school and registering them as independent homeschoolers. During the first week of July, so many parents pulled their kids out of school in North Carolina that it crashed the state's non-public education website where parents would indicate their intent to homeschool. Similarly, we found in NPR reporting, for example, homeschool applications up 21% in Nebraska in July, up 75% in Vermont, and grassroots local homeschool organizations and Facebook groups just seeing remarkable growth and interest as parents really began to embrace the idea of these schooling alternatives. And then last week, Gallup came out with a poll finding that 10% of families said that they would choose homeschooling this year, which was double the rate that they said in the Gallup poll last year. So prior to the pandemic, under ordinary times in the US, we have about 2 million homeschoolers, which is about 3.5% of the overall K-12 school population. And now, that's suggesting that that might be doubling. And this was really families indicating independent homeschooling. So pulling their children from a district school or from an independent school and choosing to have the full freedom and flexibility of homeschooling. So with that the Gallup poll really distinguished between independent homeschoolers and families who might still be doing remote learning from home, but still tied to their district school or to their private school. So that's been really, really fascinating. And that same Gallup poll finding overall satisfaction with public schools, with district schools really plummeting, and fewer families wanting to send their kids there. And so that was down to about 76% of parents who plan to send their kids to a district school. I think what we're seeing through the pandemic is parents really taking charge of their children's education and perhaps getting a better sense of what their children are or maybe are not learning. And I think we're also seeing that kids might be happier and families might be seeing that their children are happier. In fact, the BBC just reported last week on a University of Bristol survey finding that anxiety levels among young teenagers dropped during the coronavirus pandemic. There was similar research recently reported here in the US by Peter Gray, who's a Boston College psychology professor, and the organization Let Grow, that showed that, while certainly children and adolescents, like all of us, are sorely missing our friends and missing social interaction, that overall psychological well-being improved after school closures, and children appeared to gain a greater sense of independence, personal responsibility, and that parents gained a heightened appreciation of their children's capabilities. So overall, you know, I think we're really seeing parents being put back in charge in a really positive way. And I think this has also led to this explosion, certainly here in the US, of popularity in free market education alternatives available to families as parents spontaneously gather together to create what have come to be known as pandemic pods, or these micro schools where families gather together in small groups to either take turns facilitating a curriculum with their children, as if they've opted out of a district school and registered as independent homeschoolers, or if their district is going full remote learning, they're getting together in these pandemic pods to do that remote learning as a small group, but still connected to their school. So this has been really fascinating. I think there's also a lot of entrepreneurship that's been triggered as a result of this pandemic pod movement and the growth in microschool networks that were already occurring even prior to the pandemic. We're seeing, you know, many teachers, for example, being the ones to start some of these microschool enablers or pandemic pod connection websites. I spoke recently with one teacher who was a high school English teacher in Illinois who said she can make more money now as a tutor and a pandemic pod facilitator than she could in her typical school job. And so she's really excited for the opportunities that are coming her way. So, you know, I think that we'll, because of this excitement around pandemic pods and schooling alternatives, there'll be an increased interest in education choice mechanisms. For example, education savings accounts that work like vouchers to enable parents to have access to school funding. Here in the US, we spend over $15,000 per pupil per year on K-12 schooling. That's over $700 billion each year going to public schooling. And if a fraction of that money went to families, and funded families instead of systems, we would see a whole new level of accessibility of these schooling alternatives that so many families seem to really be clamoring for. So I'll just sort of wrap up by saying where we are now in terms of reopening. There have been a lot of battles over in-person reopening. Most of the largest school districts and cities in the US have gone remote learning only. Most of that, or much of that, is being tied towards teacher union pushback of really stymieing efforts to reopen schools. So that's going to continue to play out. And I think it's because of that, because of sort of this uncertainty with back to school plans, as well as some of these social distancing requirements and all-day mask wearing that you've mentioned earlier, that are really turning parents off, and they just don't want their kids in that kind of environment. They want, you know, a much freer, much more informal, sort of comforting, nurturing environment than they would be finding in these schools. So they're really seeking these alternatives. So, you know, I think if we think about where this is going to go, you know, during the pandemic and after, I think we'll continue to see parental empowerment. I think, again, parents have been put back in charge of their children's education in ways that they've never been able to before, and they will continue to demand more choice and more options. I think we'll continue to see this wider embrace of homeschooling and the freedom and flexibility that that offers, particularly seeing education as separate and distinct from schooling. So I think we'll continue to see also an uptick in this micro school movement and some of these other schooling alternatives, as well as all of the virtual learning options that are sprouting here. Definitely, I think a lot of this will be driven by entrepreneurship and the spontaneous creation of more of these schooling alternatives. Often, again, these entrepreneurs are educators or parents who are trying to meet this demand. I'm hoping that we'll still see some deregulation. We're starting to see a little bit of that in the education space here, allowing, for example, after-school programs to offer daytime programming in states where they may not have been able to do that before, or allowing licensed daycare providers to offer all day care or care to older students, not just young children. I think that's a good sign. And I think finally, I'm hopeful that because there's this larger focus now on education choice and education options, that we'll see a push for education funding to change, to follow students and support students, not systems.
Well, thank you very much for that, Kerry. I'm going to ask a very quick follow-up question from Simon Bunce in the chat, who asked, do you believe that the kind of solutions or the innovative alternatives that you're talking about is going to help solve the point that our previous speakers have made around disadvantaged children? I know you've written a little on the kind of impacts that these have had so far on pupils from more disadvantaged backgrounds.
Right. I think what we're seeing now is just so many families realizing that, education choice, school choice has been available to more advantaged, more affluent families for quite a long time. And they're starting to say, why isn't everyone given this choice and given this access? So that's where I think these education savings accounts are really important. I mean, again, thinking about if that $15,000 on average per pupil per year spending went to families instead of systems, that opens up huge doors of opportunity and options for education innovation, new learning models, and so on, where all families can have access and choice.
So we're now going to go to the audience Q&A, and we've got plenty of questions to get through and not too much time, so we'll try and do this quickly. A non-unionized UCU academic asks, what realistically can be done about the teaching unions? As Joanna says, the vulnerable pupils have been and will continue to be the biggest losers here, and teaching unions, in the opinion of this academic, are using pupils for political purposes. So maybe Joanna, that's one for you.
Yeah, very quickly, in answer to that, I think this is where we really have lacked a strong steer from national government. I think the case needs to have been made early and often, that schools need to be open, and that needed to be absolutely non-negotiable. I think the problem is, as soon as the government kind of went down the slippery slope of making concessions to the demands of the teaching unions, then there was no stopping it. And we see this even now, with more and more demands for masks and for children to be treated in a particular way. And I just, it needed a really strong steer from the government, I think, and that unfortunately was lacking right from the start.
If I can jump in on that one as well, Daniel, because the unions have become militant. I think they've become a political entity in and of themselves. They used to be about protecting their members, and now I think they think they're the opposition to the government, because whatever the government suggests, the teachers' unions are always going against it and promoting the opposite. So we need to curb their power, I think. They're not democratic, they're not representative of their members. We need to make them accountable to their members again, and encourage them to stop trying to direct policy and start trying to look after teachers.
So just to but back in again, I think Calvin's absolutely right, but I think the way to do it perhaps is not through government kind of banning unions. I'm not saying Calvin's suggesting this for 1 second, but really what we need is some pushback from teachers to vote out the current leadership, who it seems to me are actually exploiting children. I think Calvin's absolutely right. These are politically motivated attacks on the current government because they don't like the government, which is fair enough for adults to have a political issue with the government of the day, but to exploit children or university students seem to be the focus now in order to score political points, I think is immoral as far as I'm concerned.
Question for you, Carrie, I think from Nick Cowan, that's a really interesting one. Does the different sizes of homes between the UK and the US perhaps explain the different experience and possibility of homeschooling? I know I've lived in DC, which is hardly representative of the average US home, but it does seem to me as though there's that's kind of an important factor. And I guess that there's also cultural factors here as well. It might be a question of higher social cohesion in the US as to why there's more of a homeschooling culture. But yeah, your thoughts on that?
Well, I live in Boston, Massachusetts, so similar in terms of square footage, probably to those of you in London. I think homeschooling in the U.S. is quite varied. It's as diverse as the overall U.S. population. I would say the fastest growing segment of the homeschool population here is in urban secular families. So that's an interesting point around square footage. I don't think that it necessarily relates to that as well. I think what we're seeing, and perhaps why there's been such a surge in interest in urban homes for homeschooling, again, which would have generally lower square footage than out in the suburbs and the countryside, I think, is that there are so many organizations, museums, libraries, nonprofits, businesses, and so on, that offer programming daily for homeschoolers. So, you know, I often say that we spend more of our time outside of our homes homeschooling than inside of our homes. And I think that that's true, you know, for many homeschoolers now. And of course, again, that's where in the pandemic, you know, we're also separated from that community and from those resources. But the fact that even given that disconnection and separation, families are still embracing schooling, education without schooling, I think is a sign of things to come.
A few questions on the masks issue. Dominic asks, can you provide any evidence that masks are a health risk for children? And David points out that there are masks available with a see-through area around the mouth. Perhaps these would help with the chewing gum problems that Calvin was talking about.
If I go into that one first, I mean, I think we need to put the masks issue in context, essentially, and it needs to be put in, first of all, in the context of the risks that coronavirus poses to children. As we've said on a number of us have said now, you know, no child has died from coronavirus. So wearing masks seems to me a completely disproportionate response to something that is no threat to children whatsoever. You also have to put, as Calvin absolutely correctly illustrated, masks in the context of how they are worn. Masks are as good as you wear them. If you wear a mask that's dropped on the floor of a toilet and been rolled around the bottom of a bus and been kicked around as a football, that mask is going to give you not only less protection, but is actually going to be a source of danger. You will be breathing in germs, and you will potentially be breathing in germs very directly for a fairly substantial period of time. Beyond that, you look at children who don't have respiratory systems that are as developed as adults, who spend a lot more time, hopefully, we would like to think, running around and playing and just being giddy than adults do, who need to be able to breathe freely, and having a piece of dirty cloth, which is what it will be, around your mouth is a health risk to children rather than a preventative health measure.
A couple of, sorry, go on, Calvin.
Say Joanna's spot on. I have a hard enough time convincing children to have their shoelaces tied and their uniform done up properly. Having another thing to manage, getting 1,200 pupils to wear their mask correctly and not adjust it at any point throughout the day is bad enough. But then the suggestion is that they're going to have to take these masks off to go into lesson and put them back on when they go into communal areas. Surely that renders them useless, because you're taking them off and putting them on, and you're touching them and you're spreading those germs and bacteria like Joanna talks about. It might not be detrimental to their health, but it's certainly not going to provide any assurances, is it?
Yeah, I potentially, I'm not sure I'm as convinced as you, Calvin, or Joanna, on the kind of general arguments against shutdown, just on the basis of what I mentioned earlier, and my follow-up question to you, Joanna, about it not really, the kids not being really the main focus in terms of spreading coronavirus. It's more if they do end up seeing their grandparents, and if, you know, the same kids that are struggling to keep their school uniform in check might not necessarily respond to instructions as well about not visiting their older relatives and stuff like that. But it's certainly it's one that I think maybe divides some on the free market or the civil libertarian side of the argument. There's a couple of questions here on the kind of poor internet facility. So Layson, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, points out that he or she is a professor, and their experience with using technology, more than half their students were left out of it. A number of average students couldn't keep up, but a minority of good students said they learned more and better than during in-person classes. So that might be reinforcing the divide that was mentioned. And another question, do you think that showing online videos during online sessions will help students learn when they have poor internet facilities? I think that one kind of answers itself a little bit. Just looking through some of the other questions. This one's an interesting one from Christian Gowers. How do we overcome the likely problem that participation in catch-up clubs is mostly limited to the same pupils who also participate in remote learning and were less impacted than more disadvantaged pupils? Maybe Calvin want to ponder?
I think we just have to be tough. We have to make some of these things mandatory. We have to talk about how important it is to catch up and how much they've missed out on, and we can demonstrate that and say, look, your year group is coming over Easter, your year group is coming over Christmas for a few days. It's got to be done, and otherwise you're going to miss out. We just kind of really be tough on it and say that's what we're doing as a school. But as long as it is autonomous, and as long as schools can set their own agenda around that, and it's not a blanket policy from the top down.
Carrie, just coming back to the teaching unions question that Joanna and Calvin answered earlier, do you feel like it's a significant issue in the US, the same sort of roles being played by the teaching unions in kind of suppressing any sort of innovation or reasonable solutions?
Yes, and it's certainly come to light during the pandemic. I think, though, that this may be changing, that maybe some of their power may be weakening. The Wall Street Journal had an op-ed a few days ago talking about how this could be kind of a final strike toward teachers' unions again, because so many families are opting out of these district schools for their own private options. And so, that's one way of certainly weakening. But yeah, I think, we're seeing already today, New York City, the start date has now been pushed back to later in September because of teacher union pushback. Teachers unions in other states have managed to do the same thing. They've managed to push to remote learning only in many districts. In Florida, the teachers union sued the state for their in-person reopening plans. That was upheld in the courts. So, definitely seeing the teachers unions stymieing back to school reopening plans.
Just a final one to end on, because I feel like, I could be wrong here, but I feel like maybe you, Carrie, have a slightly different perspective on homeschooling to Joanna and Calvin. I was just wondering, is that true? And maybe what are the points of contention here? Because it seems like different perspectives.
Yeah, there was so much in Carrie's great talk that I disagreed with, but I completely...
And so much in yours that I did. That's what's great about this, right?
But I loved your point about empowerment in education and giving parental choice. I think that's the important aspect about what you were talking about. And we need more of that in the UK. I know in the US, you've got your charter schools. We've got our free schools over here that are starting to make a difference now. And we're seeing the results of what happens when teachers and parents get together and say, this is the kind of school we want to create in this area where it's needed. And they're getting amazing results out of it.
I think that might be a good point of harmony and content to end this webinar on. But a thank you to all of our speakers, Joanna, Calvin, and Carrie, for joining us. It's been really interesting. I've certainly learned a lot. And thank you all, the attendees, for coming. And we'll be announcing our next Tuesday webinar shortly. But thank you again, and goodbye for now.
Thanks,
everyone. Take care.